I remember the exact moment everything changed. The dinner rush had ended an hour before, but the kitchen still held its heat like a living thing. Steam rose from the dishwasher in lazy spirals, and the fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune overhead. I was wiping down the steel counter for the third time that night, my movements automatic practiced. The rag moved in small circles, erasing the evidence of another ordinary shift. The diner felt different when it was empty. During the day, it buzzed with conversation and the clatter of silverware, families sliding into vinyl booths, truckers hunched over coffee that had been sitting too long. But after 10 o'clock, when the last customer pushed through the glass door with its cheerful bell, the place transformed into something quieter, more honest. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper. I had been working there for 8 months, long enough to know the rhythm of Gabriel's movements behind me. He moved through that kitchen like he owned every inch of it, which he did. I could hear him without turning around, the soft scrape of his spatula against the grill, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other when he was thinking. Tonight, though, something felt different in the air between us. The refrigerators hummed their mechanical lullaby, and somewhere in the dining room, the ice machine dropped cubes into its tray with a distant rumble. I focused on these sounds, letting them anchor me to the familiar. The counter was clean now, had been for several minutes, but I kept wiping because it gave my hand something to do. That was when I felt him move closer. Gabriel's presence filled spaces in a way that other people's didn't. He was broad-shouldered and solid, the kind of man who looked like he had been carved from something dependable. When he stepped behind me, I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the lingering scent of coffee and cigarette smoke that seemed to follow him everywhere. He reached past me, his chest nearly brushing my shoulder, and I heard the soft metallic click of the back door lock turning. The sound echoed in the quiet kitchen, louder than it should have been, final as a period at the end of a sentence. I stopped wiping. The rag went still in my hands. Gabriel moved slowly, deliberately, like he was giving me time to object, to step away, to break whatever spell was settling over us. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Something in my chest had gone tight and warm, something I had been carrying for months without naming. His hands found mine where they rested on the counter. They were larger than mine, calloused from years of working with his hands, building this place from nothing into something that mattered. He lifted my hands gently, turned me to face him, then placed my palms flat against the worn apron tied around his waist. The fabric was soft from countless washings, warm from his body underneath. I could feel his heartbeat through it, steady and strong. My fingers spread instinctively against the cotton, and I realized I'd been wondering what this would feel like for longer than I cared to admit. Gabriel's eyes were darker than usual in the kitchen light, serious in a way that made my breath catch. He had always been a man of few words, someone who let his actions speak louder than anything he might say. But standing there with my hands pressed against his apron, with the taste of anticipation thick in the air between us, words seemed unnecessary anyway. When he leaned in, time seemed to slow. I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw tightened with something that might have been uncertainty or desire. His breath was warm against my face, carrying the scent of the coffee he had been nursing since the afternoon. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like I had imagined during the long nights when sleep eluded me and my thoughts wandered to places I wasn't supposed to let them go. It wasn't gentle or questioning. It was sudden and fierce, tasting of coffee and smoke, and something indefinable that was purely Gabriel. His mouth moved against mine with a hunger that spoke of restraint finally breaking, of walls carefully constructed over months crumbling in an instant. My hands fisted in his apron, holding on as if I might fall without that anchor. The kitchen spun around us, the familiar sounds fading into background noise. There was only the press of his lips, the warmth of his body against mine, the way my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. When we broke apart, the silence that followed felt different from the comfortable quiet we had shared during countless shifts. This silence was charged, electric with possibility and fear in equal measure. Gabriel's breathing was slightly uneven, and I could see something raw and vulnerable in his expression that I had never witnessed before. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and ragged, like the words had been scraped from somewhere deep inside him. "This stays between us." But even as he said it, even as I nodded my understanding, I knew that something fundamental had shifted. The kitchen around us looked the same, the steel surfaces gleaming under the fluorescent lights, the grill still radiating heat from the dinner rush, the smell of grease and cleaning solution hanging in the air like it always did. But I felt different, changed, like I had been sleepwalking through my life and had finally, suddenly, woken up. I had spent 21 years moving through the world quietly, keeping my head down, avoiding notice. I had dropped out of college when the money ran out and taken the job at the diner because it paid enough to cover rent and didn't require explanations I wasn't ready to give. I had convinced myself that invisible was safe, that wanting nothing meant risking nothing. But standing there with Gabriel's taste still on my lips and his apron bunched in my fists, I realized that safety was just another word for the slow suffocation of never really living. The kiss had lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it had torn through my carefully constructed walls like they were made of paper. Gabriel stepped back, putting space between us, but his eyes never left my face. I could see him working through what had just happened, weighing the implications, calculating the risks. He was 11 years older than me, my employer, a man who had built his reputation in this small town through hard work and reliability. What we had just done could complicate everything. But as I watched him process and plan and worry, all I could think was that nothing would feel ordinary again. The taste of him lingered on my tongue. The warmth of his body remained imprinted on my palms. The lock on the back door had turned with a click that sounded like a promise, and I knew that whatever happened next, I had already crossed a line I could never uncross. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The refrigerators continued their mechanical chorus. The ice machine dropped another load of cubes with its familiar rumble. But the kitchen no longer felt like just a workplace. It felt like the place where my real life had finally begun. I had never been the kind of person who drew attention. 21 years old, and I moved through the world like I was apologizing for taking up space. College had been a brief experiment in trying to become someone different, someone who belonged in lecture halls and study groups. But when the financial aid ran out halfway through my sophomore year, I had slipped away without fanfare. No one seemed to notice. The diner job found me through a handwritten sign taped to the window of a coffee shop I couldn't afford to buy anything from. Help wanted. Night shift. Experience preferred, but not required. I had folded the paper with the phone number into my wallet and carried it for 3 days before I worked up the courage to call. Gabriel had hired me on spot. I remember sitting across from him in one of the vinyl booths, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and catching the silver threads in his dark hair. He had asked me only a few questions. Could I work nights? Did I mind getting my hands dirty? Was I reliable? I had answered yes to all of them, though I wasn't entirely sure about the last one. I had never been reliable to anyone, including myself. But something about the diner made me want to try. Maybe it was the way Gabriel moved through the space like he had built it with his own hands, which he had. Maybe it was the way the regulars knew their seats, their usual orders, the rhythm of their lives. Or maybe it was simply that I needed a place where I could disappear into routine, where I could let the work carry me through the days without having to think too hard about what I was doing with my life. Gabriel was 32 then, though he carried himself like someone older. He had the kind of presence that made people step aside without realizing they were doing it. Broad shoulders, steady hands, a face that revealed nothing unless he chose to let it. The other staff treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence, and I quickly learned why. He knew every aspect of the business, could fix anything that broke, and never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. To the customers, he was exactly what a diner owner should be. Gruff but dependable, someone who remembered how you liked your coffee and whether you wanted extra pickles on your burger. He moved between the kitchen and the dining room with an ease that spoke of years of practice, years of building something from nothing and making it work through sheer determination. But to me, he was something different, something I couldn't quite name. During those first few months, We fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. I would arrive for my shift at 6 in the evening, tie on my apron, and slip into the familiar routine of washing dishes, prepping vegetables, cleaning the endless surfaces that collected grease and fingerprints. Gabriel worked the grill during the dinner rush. His movements, economical and precise, never wasted motion. We didn't talk much. Gabriel wasn't a man who filled silence with unnecessary words, and I had always been more comfortable listening than speaking. But our silence felt different from the awkward quiet I experienced with other people. It felt intentional, comfortable, like we understood each other without needing to explain. When I passed behind him in the narrow kitchen, he would shift slightly to give me room. When he needed something from the walk-in cooler, he would catch my eye and nod, and I would know to step aside. We moved around each other like dancers who had rehearsed the choreography until it became instinct. Sometimes I would catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. When I looked up from whatever task I was focused on, his gaze would linger for just a moment longer than it should have before he turned back to the grill. Those moments made something flutter in my chest, something I pushed down because it felt dangerous to examine too closely. The other employees came and went. Part-time waitresses saving money for college, a cook who lasted 3 weeks before deciding the hours were too demanding, a dishwasher who showed up drunk twice and was quietly let go. But Gabriel and I remained constant, the steady center around which the diner's daily life revolved. I had always been invisible to most people, but Gabriel saw me. Not just as an employee who showed up on time and did the work, but as something more. He noticed when I was tired, when I was struggling with a particularly stubborn pot, when I needed a few extra minutes to compose myself after a difficult customer. He never made a big show of it, never drew attention to his observations. He would simply appear with a cup of coffee when I needed caffeine, or take over a task when my hand was shaking with exhaustion. Gabriel's attention felt like sunlight after years of shadow. I began to look forward to our shifts together, to the comfortable silence and the occasional brief exchanges that felt weighted with meaning I couldn't quite decipher. When he asked me to stay late to help with inventory, I agreed without hesitation. When he showed me how to prep the grill for the morning shift, I memorized every word he said. I started paying attention to details I had never noticed before. The way he rolled up his sleeves when the kitchen got hot, the careful way he handled the vintage coffee machine that had been in the diner since before he bought it, the rare smile that transformed his entire face when one of the regular customers told him a particularly good joke. And slowly, carefully, I began to realize that what I felt for Gabriel was more than professional respect or simple gratitude for steady employment. It was something that made my pulse quicken when he stood close enough for me to smell his cologne mixed with coffee and smoke. Something that made me hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance, every moment when the space between us seemed to hum with possibility. I had never wanted anyone the way I wanted Gabriel. Had never felt this particular combination of admiration and longing and fear that made my hands shake when he handed me a plate or asked me to reach something from a high shelf. I told myself it was one-sided, that I was imagining the lingering looks and the deliberate touches, until the night he locked the door and placed my hands against his apron and kissed me like he had been thinking about it for as long as I had. The morning after the kiss, I arrived for my shift 15 minutes early, my stomach twisted into knots. I had barely slept, replaying every second of what had happened in the kitchen, analyzing every touch, every word, every breath. Part of me wondered if Gabriel would pretend it had never happened, if the professional distance between employer and employee would snap back into place like a rubber band release. When I pushed through the back door, Gabriel was already at the grill, his movements as methodical and controlled as always. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I felt my heart stop entirely. Then he nodded, the same brief acknowledgement he had given me every day for 8 months, and turned back to the eggs he was preparing for the breakfast rush. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying no trace of the roughness it had held the night before. "You're early." I mumbled something about not being able to sleep and tied on my apron with hands that trembled slightly. The familiar routine of preparing for the morning shift felt different now. charged with an undercurrent of tension that made every ordinary action feel significant. When I reached for the stack of clean plates, Gabriel was there, lifting them down from the high shelf without being asked. When I moved to fill the coffee machine with water, he stepped aside to give me room, but not before his fingers brushed against my wrist as he handed me the carafe. The touch was so brief, it could have been accidental. But the way his fingers lingered, the way his eyes met mine for just a moment longer than necessary, told me it was anything but casual. It became a pattern over the following days. Gabriel acted unchanged on the surface, still gruff with difficult customers, still efficient with orders, still the steady presence that kept the diner running smoothly. But underneath the professional exterior, something had shifted. When I passed behind him in the narrow space between the grill and the prep counter, his hand would find my hip, guiding me past him with a touch that was deliberate and fleeting. When he needed to reach around me for ingredients, his chest would brush against my back, and I would feel the warmth of his body through his shirt. These moments happened so quickly that anyone watching would have dismissed them as the natural contact of two people working in close quarters. But I felt each touch like an electric shock, a reminder of what had passed between us in the quiet of the locked kitchen. The dinner rush kept us busy enough that conversation was limited to the essentials. More coffee for table 6. The grill needs cleaning. We're running low on pie. But during the slower afternoon hours, when the lunch crowd had dispersed and the evening customers hadn't yet arrived, Gabriel began finding reasons to linger near me. He would stand close enough that I could smell his cologne, ostensibly checking my prep work or explaining a new procedure, but his attention felt different now. More focused, more personal. Sometimes I would look up from chopping vegetables to find him watching me with an intensity that made my hands falter. One evening, after the last customer had left and I was stacking chairs on tables so the morning crew could mop properly, Gabriel emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 plates. He had prepared slices of apple pie, the kind his grandmother's recipe had made famous among the locals, and he set one down in front of me as he slid into the booth across from me. I hadn't eaten since my lunch break 6 hours earlier, but suddenly food seemed impossible. Gabriel's presence across the narrow table filled my entire field of vision, and I found myself studying details I had noticed but never allowed myself to dwell on. The way his dark hair was starting to silver at the temples, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands from years of physical work. "You don't talk much," he said, cutting into his pie with deliberate precision. His voice was casual, but there was something underneath it that made my pulse quicken. I shrugged, taking a small bite to buy myself time to think. "Don't have much to say." Gabriel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He looked at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing, and I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights overhead. "You don't have to," he said finally. "I hear you anyway." The words hit me like a physical blow. I set down my fork because my hands had started shaking, and I stared at the pie I could no longer taste. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. No one had ever suggested that my silence contained something worth hearing, that my presence alone might be enough. Gabriel continued eating as if he hadn't just turned my understanding of myself upside down. But I could feel his attention on me, patient and steady, waiting for some kind of response I didn't know how to give. The pie sat untouched on my plate, while my chest filled with something warm and overwhelming. For years, I had convinced myself that being invisible was a choice, a form of protection. But sitting across from Gabriel in the empty diner, I realized that what I had mistaken for safety was actually a kind of slow suffocation. I had been holding my breath for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Gabriel finished his pie and sat back, his hands resting flat on the table between us. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt full, pregnant with possibility and unspoken understanding. Finally, I pushed my plate away and met his gaze. "The pie was perfect," I said, though I had barely tasted it. "Thank you." Gabriel smiled then, a small upturn of his mouth that transformed his entire face. It was the first time I'd seen him smile just for me, not for a customer or in response to someone else's joke. The warmth of it settled in my chest like a physical thing, solid and reassuring. As we sat there in the quiet diner, surrounded by the familiar smells of coffee and grease and the lingering warmth from the kitchen, I understood that something fundamental was shifting between us. The locked door, the kiss, these small moments of connection, they were building towards something I couldn't yet name, but could feel approaching like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. When Gabriel finally stood to clear our plates, his hand brushed against my shoulder, brief but intentional. The touch sent heat radiating down my arm, and I knew that whatever was happening between us was only just beginning. After that night, with the pie, something shifted in the rhythm of our evenings. Gabriel began finding more reasons for me to stay after closing, small tasks that required both of us to complete. The register needed balancing. The walk-in cooler had developed a concerning rattle that required investigation. The ice machine's stubborn temperament demanded 2 people to coax it back to life. These excuses became routine, and I found myself looking forward to them with an anticipation that made my chest tight. During the dinner rush, I would catch myself glancing at the clock, counting the hours until the last customer would leave, and we could exist in the quiet intimacy of the empty diner. Our silences during these extended evenings felt different from the comfortable quiet we had shared during regular shifts. These silences pulsed with an energy I couldn't name, heavy with words neither of us seemed ready to speak. Gabriel would sit in the back booth while I finished cleaning the coffee machine, or I would organize inventory while he updated the week's receipts. We moved around each other in the familiar space, but every gesture felt deliberate, weighted with meaning. The touching became more frequent, more intentional. Gabriel started showing me tasks I already knew how to do, using the pretense of instruction to guide my hands with his. When I struggled with the ancient dough mixer that had a tendency to stick, he stepped behind me, his arms reaching around to cover my hands with his larger ones. His chest pressed against my back as he demonstrated the proper technique, his breath warm against my ear as he explained the machine's quirks. "The dough doesn't need force," he murmured, his hands moving mine in slow, steady circles. "It needs patience, consistency. Let it tell you what it wants." His voice was lower than usual, and I could feel the vibration of it through his chest against my shoulders. My hands trembled slightly under his guidance, not from the effort of working the dough, but from the awareness of his body surrounding mine, protecting and teaching and claiming all at once. When the dough finally achieved the proper consistency, Gabriel's hands lingered over mine for several heartbeats longer than necessary. I could feel his breathing against my neck, shallow and controlled, and I wondered if he could hear how fast my heart was beating. Another night, the grill's pilot light went out, and Gabriel enlisted my help in relighting it. He showed me how to access the control panel, how to hold the lighter at the precise angle to catch the gas. His hands covered mine as we worked together, his fingers steady and sure as he guided the small flame to its target. "You have good hands," he said, watching as I successfully relit the pilot on my own. "Steady, patient. That matters in this work." I looked up at him, searching his face for some indication of whether he was talking about the grill or something else entirely. His expression was unreadable in the dim light of the kitchen, but his eyes held mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. These lessons continued over the following weeks. Gabriel taught me how to repair the temperamental coffee machine, how to adjust the ancient cash register when it jammed, how to properly season the grill so it wouldn't rust overnight. Each task required his hands on mine, his body close enough that I could feel his warmth, his voice in my ear explaining techniques that seemed to apply to more than just restaurant equipment. The ice machine became our most frequent excuse. It was older than either of us, a hulking behemoth that required 2 people to move when it inevitably broke down. Gabriel would call me over with a gesture, and together we would wrestle the machine away from the wall, our bodies working in tandem to access the mechanical components that needed adjustment. These repairs often took longer than they should have, our movements slowing as we became aware of how we fit together in the cramped space behind the machine. Gabriel's shoulder would brush against mine as he reached for a tool. My hip would bump against his as I shifted to get a better angle. The proximity was intoxicating, making every ordinary interaction feel charged with possibility. One evening, as we knelt beside the ice machine attempting to diagnose a particularly stubborn problem, I found myself studying Gabriel's profile in the harsh fluorescent light. His jaw was set in concentration, his brow furrowed as he examined a loose connection. There was something beautiful about his focus, the way he approached every problem with methodical patience. "Why me?" I heard myself ask, the words escaping before I could stop them. Gabriel's hands stilled on the machine. He didn't look up, didn't meet my eyes, but I could see the tension that suddenly filled his shoulders. The question hung in the air between us, too big and too honest for the cramped space we occupied. I immediately regretted asking it, feared I had pushed too hard, revealed too much of what I was feeling. For a long moment, Gabriel continued working on the machine, his movements careful and deliberate. Then, without looking up, he spoke, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. "Because you don't flinch when I'm near." The words hit me like a revelation, simple and profound. I thought about all the ways I had unconsciously leaned into his presence over the past months, how I had never pulled away from his touches, how I had sought out his proximity rather than avoiding it. In a world where Gabriel clearly had to be careful about how he moved, how he connected with people, I had been a safe harbor without even realizing it. My breath caught, and I felt something profound shift inside my chest, a recognition of what I meant to him and what he was beginning to mean to me. We knelt there beside the ice machine, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, surrounded by the familiar smells of the kitchen, and neither of us said anything more. But in that silence, heavy with understanding and unspoken promises, I felt the foundation of something real taking shape between us. Something that went beyond employer and employee, beyond the simple attraction I had been trying to ignore. Something that felt like the beginning of a story I had never dared to imagine for myself. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday night when the dinner rush had been particularly brutal. A bus full of teenagers had descended on us just before closing, loud and demanding and leaving chaos in their wake. By the time the last of them had finally left, both Gabriel and I were exhausted, moving through the closing routine with mechanical precision born of too many long nights. I was at the sink, working my way through the mountain of dishes they had generated, when I felt Gabriel's presence behind me. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of running water and the distant hum of the refrigerators. My shoulders ached from hunching over the sink, and my hands were pruned from the hot dishwater. Gabriel moved closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I continued washing dishes, hyper-aware of his proximity, but trying to maintain the pretense that this was just another ordinary evening. The stack of plates seemed endless, each one requiring careful attention to remove the stubborn remnants of teenage appetites. That was when Gabriel's hand touched my shoulder, firm and warm through my shirt. I nearly dropped the plate I was holding, my breath catching as his fingers pressed gently against the knots of tension that had formed there. "You're wound tight," he said, his voice low and close to my ear. "Too tight." His other hand joined the first, both palms now resting on my shoulders. I stood frozen at the sink, the plate forgotten in my soapy hands, as Gabriel's thumbs began to work small circles against the base of my neck. The touch was careful, almost clinical, but there was something underneath it that made my pulse quicken. I should have stepped away, should have made some excuse about finishing the dishes, about being tired, about needing to get home. But instead I found myself leaning into his touch, my eyes falling closed as the tension in my shoulders began to dissolve under his careful ministrations. Gabriel's hands were larger than mine, callous from years of manual work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He worked methodically, finding each knot of stress and easing it away with patient pressure. When he found a particularly tight spot, I couldn't suppress the small sound that escaped my throat, part relief and part something deeper. "Better?" he asked, his breath warm against my ear. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. But Gabriel didn't stop. His hands continued their work, moving from my shoulders to the base of my neck, his fingers threading through my hair to massage my scalp. The sensation was so intimate, so caring, that I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. No one had ever touched me like this before, with such attention, such focus on my comfort and well-being. Gabriel's hands moved with purpose, not taking anything for himself, but simply giving, offering relief from the physical manifestation of stress and exhaustion that I carried in my body. When his hands finally stilled, resting warm and heavy on my shoulders, I realized I was trembling, not from cold or fear, but from the overwhelming nature of being cared for in such a fundamental way. I turned around slowly, still within the circle of his arms, and found myself face to face with Gabriel in the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. His expression was different than I had ever seen it before. The careful control he usually maintained was cracking, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. His dark eyes searched my face, and I could see the internal battle being waged there, professional restraint warring with something much more personal and dangerous. "You think I don't notice the way you look at me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between us like a challenge, direct and uncompromising in a way that our previous conversations had not been. I felt heat rise to my face, the blood rushing to my cheeks as I realized how transparent I had been, how poorly I had hidden what I felt for him. "And what if I do?" I managed to ask, my voice smaller than I intended, but steady enough to convey that I wasn't backing down from whatever this confrontation was leading toward. Gabriel's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might pull away, might retreat behind the professional distance that had kept us both safe for so many months. But instead he stepped closer, eliminating the small space that had remained between us. His hands moved from my shoulders to frame my face, his thumbs brushing against my cheekbones with a tenderness that made my breath catch. "Then we stopped pretending," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a decision being made, of barriers being deliberately torn down. When he kissed me this time, it was different from that first fierce collision in a locked kitchen. This kiss was slower, more deliberate, filled with all the restraint that had been building between us over the weeks of careful touches and loaded silences. Gabriel's mouth moved against mine with a patience that spoke of wanting to memorize every moment, every sensation. My hands found their way to his apron again, pressing flat against the familiar cotton, but this time I didn't just hold on. I claimed. My fingers spread wide against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath the fabric, feeling the way his breathing quickened as the kiss deepened. Gabriel's hands remained gentle on my face, holding me like something precious as his mouth explored mine. I could taste the coffee he had been drinking, could smell the lingering scent of smoke and kitchen grease that always seemed to follow him. But underneath it all was something essentially Gabriel, something that made my head spin and my knees weak. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, Gabriel didn't step away. Instead, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his hands still cradling my face. "This changes everything," he said, and his voice carried both warning and promise. "I know," I whispered back, and I meant it. Whatever safety I had found in the careful distance between employer and employee was gone now, burned away by the intensity of what had just passed between us. But looking into Gabriel's eyes, seeing the way he was looking at me like I was something worth risking everything for, I found that I didn't want safety anymore. I wanted this, messy and complicated and dangerous as it might be. The weeks that followed our second kiss fell into a pattern that felt both exhilarating and unsustainable. Gabriel and I continued our professional routine during the day. He worked the grill, I handled dishes and prep. We moved around each other with the same efficient choreography we had always maintained. But underneath the surface, everything had changed. The locked doors became more frequent. After closing, Gabriel would turn the deadbolt with that same deliberate click, and we would find each other in the familiar space of the kitchen. Sometimes we talked in low voices about nothing important. The weather, a difficult customer, plans for updating the menu. But more often we simply existed together in the charged silence, stealing touches and kisses that tasted of secrecy and want. Gabriel was careful about these moments, always listening for sound from the street, always aware of who might see us through the windows. The diner sat on Main Street, visible to anyone walking by, and I began to understand the weight of what we were risking. Not just our professional relationship, but Gabriel's reputation, his business, the life he had built in this small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. I started noticing things I had missed before. The way Carol, the morning waitress, lingered near the kitchen door when Gabriel and I worked late shifts together. How Danny, the part-time cook, asked pointed questions about why we always seemed to be the last ones to leave. The curious glances from regular customers who had begun to notice that Gabriel paid special attention to me, that our interactions had taken on a quality that felt different from typical employer-employee dynamics. The scrutiny made me hyper-aware of every gesture, every word exchanged between us during business hours. I found myself overcompensating, being more formal with Gabriel than I had ever been, addressing him as sir, and avoiding eye contact when others were watching. But this performance felt like a betrayal of what we had discovered together, and I could see the frustration building in Gabriel's expression when I pulled away. One evening, after a particularly awkward shift where I'd spent 8 hours avoiding his gaze and addressing him with painful politeness, Gabriel confronted me as we cleaned the kitchen together. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tight with something that might have been anger or hurt. "You're acting like we're strangers." I kept my focus on the grill I was scrubbing, unable to meet his eyes. "People were starting to notice," he said. "Carol asked me yesterday why we always work late together. Danny made some comment about us being awfully cozy." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, and when I finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "So what are you saying?" "I don't know," I admitted, and the uncertainty in my voice revealed more than I intended. "This is your business, your reputation. I'm just some college dropout you hire to wash dishes. If people start talking..." Gabriel crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides, backing me against the prep counter with an intensity that made my breath catch. His hands braced on either side of me, trapping me within the circle of his arms, and his dark eyes burned with something fierce and possessive. "Don't," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare diminish what this is. What you are." But I could see the conflict in his expression even as he spoke the words. Gabriel had spent 11 years building his reputation in this town, had worked 17-hour days to make the diner profitable, had earned the respect of customers and suppliers through reliability and consistency. What we were doing threatened all of that. The weight of being his secret began to settle on my shoulders like a physical burden. During our stolen moments after closing, I felt precious, desired, important. But during the day, when we had to pretend that nothing had changed, I felt like a dirty secret, something to be hidden and denied. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late October. Gabriel and I had been cleaning up after a busy dinner rush when I heard the sound of keys in the front door. We both froze, Gabriel's hand still resting on my lower back where he had been guiding me past him in the narrow kitchen. Carol's voice carried from the dining room, calling out that she had forgotten her purse. Gabriel stepped away from me, so quickly that I nearly stumbled, putting professional distance between us just as Carol appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked between us with sharp, calculating eyes, taking in our positions, the tension in the air, the way Gabriel's jaw had tightened with controlled panic. Her smile was knowing and predatory, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Working late again, I see," she said, her tone light, but loaded with implication. "You two sure do spend a lot of time together after hours." Gabriel's response was perfectly neutral, professionally appropriate. "Jonah's been helping me update inventory. Extra hands make the work go faster." But I could see the cost of that casual dismissal in the way his shoulders tensed, in the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. To Carol, I was just an employee, nothing more significant than an extra pair of hands. The truth of what I meant to Gabriel had to remain hidden, unacknowledged, denied. After Carol left with her purse and her knowing smiles, Gabriel and I finished closing in strained silence. When he finally locked the door and turned to face me, I could see the exhaustion in his expression, the weight of constantly maintaining a careful facade. "If this is just locked doors and shadows," I said, the words coming out rougher than I intended, "I can't keep doing it." Gabriel's silence stretched between us, heavy with implication. I could see him calculating risks, weighing his reputation against whatever this was between us, try to find a path forward that wouldn't destroy everything he had worked to build. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The kitchen equipment settled into its nighttime quiet, and I waited for Gabriel to choose between safety and risk, between his carefully constructed life and the dangerous territory of being honest about what I meant to him. When he finally moved, it was to untie his apron with deliberate, steady hands. He folded it carefully and set it on the counter, then stepped closer to me, his dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "You're not just a secret," he said, his voice rough with conviction. "Not anymore." And in that moment, standing in the fluorescent-lit kitchen of the diner where we had found each other, I understood that Gabriel had made his choice. Whatever came next would be dangerous, costly, uncertain, but would be real. 3 months have passed since that night, when Gabriel chose us over secrecy, and the diner feels both exactly the same and completely transformed. The morning rush still brings the familiar chaos of orders and coffee refills. The grill still hisses with bacon and eggs. The refrigerators still hum their mechanical lullaby, and the ancient ice machine still drops cubes with its distinctive rumble. But the weight of hiding has lifted from my shoulders like a physical burden finally set down. Gabriel didn't make grand announcements or post declarations. He simply stopped pretending. When Carol made another pointed comment about our late nights, Gabriel looked her in the eye and said that I was more than an employee now, that I was learning the business from every angle because I had a future here. When Danny asked why I suddenly had keys to the diner, Gabriel handed me the spare set in front of the entire morning crew and told them I was being promoted to assistant manager. The transition wasn't without its complications. A few customers raised eyebrows at seeing me behind the register instead of just washing dishes. Some of the part-time staff took time to adjust to taking direction from someone they had previously seen as just another hourly worker. But Gabriel weathered it all with the same steady determination he brought to everything else, making it clear through his actions that I belonged here, that this wasn't a temporary arrangement or a whim. The real change happened after closing time. The locked door no longer felt like a barrier between us and the outside world, but simply the natural end of the business day. What happened in the kitchen after 10 o'clock was no longer stolen moments snatched between careful performances, but the comfortable intimacy of two people building something real together. I wear an apron now, too, tied over my chest with the same worn strings that Gabriel has used for years. He ordered it specially, had my name embroidered on the pocket in small, precise letters. The first time I put it on, Gabriel stopped what he was doing and stared at me for a long moment, something profound passing across his expression. "Looks right," he said simply, but his voice carried the weight of a promise. We work side by side at the grill now, during busy nights, our movements synchronized in a way that speaks of countless hours of practice. Gabriel shows me the subtle art of timing multiple orders, how to read the rhythm of the kitchen, how to anticipate what needs to happen next before the need becomes urgent. His teaching is patient and thorough, but there's something else underneath it now: pride in what I'm becoming, satisfaction in watching me grow into skills I never thought I possessed. When we prep vegetables together, Gabriel's hands still cover mine occasionally, but the touches no longer carry the electric charge of forbidden contact. Instead, they feel like the natural affection between two people who have chosen each other, who are building something together that extends beyond the boundaries of the diner. The kitchen has become our shared space in a way that feels permanent and settled. Gabriel bought a small radio that sits on the shelf above the prep station, and we work to the quiet background of late-night jazz and blues. Sometimes when the last dish is washed and the grill is clean, we sit together in the back booth sharing coffee and talking about plans for the diner. Small improvements we could make, menu items we want to try, the slow but steady process of building something that belongs to both of us. Gabriel still smokes his cigarettes on the back step after closing, but now I join him, standing close enough that our shoulders touch in the cool night air. We don't talk much during these moments. Gabriel has always been a man of few words, and I have learned that some kinds of understanding don't require conversation. But the silence between us is rich with contentment. with the satisfaction of work well done and the promise of tomorrow. The most profound change is in how I see myself reflected in Gabriel's eyes. For 21 years, I had moved through the world believing I was forgettable, easily overlooked, worth only as much as the work I could provide. But Gabriel looks at me like I am something precious, something worth investing in, someone whose thoughts and opinions and presence matter beyond what I can contribute with my hands. When I make suggestions about the menu or notice problems with equipment before they become serious, Gabriel listens with the kind of attention he gives to important matters. When I successfully handle a difficult customer or manage a particularly busy rush, he acknowledges my competence with a respect that feels earned rather than given. Some evenings, after we've finished the closing routine and turned off the fluorescent lights, Gabriel and I stand together in the darkened kitchen, the familiar space transformed by shadows and the soft glow from the streetlights outside. In these moments, I can feel the weight of what we've built together. Not just the relationship between us, but the sense of belonging, of purpose, of having found a place where I fit. Gabriel's hands rest on my shoulders, warm and steady, and I lean back against his chest, feeling his heartbeat through his shirt. The apron strings are loose around my waist, the fabric worn soft from washing, but it feels like armor against the world that once saw me as invisible. The kiss, when it comes, tastes familiar now, coffee and smoke, and something essentially Gabriel that I have learned to recognize as home. But it still carries the same weight of promise it held that first night when he locked the door and pressed my hand against his apron. The kitchen around us holds the evidence of our shared labor. The clean surfaces, the organized prep station, the grill seasoned and ready for tomorrow's service. But more than that, it holds the truth of what we've become. Two people who chose each other despite the risks, who built something real in the space between the dinner rush and dawn. When Gabriel pulls away, his eyes hold mine in the dim light, and I see my future reflected there. Not just the next shift or the next week, but years of mornings spent preparing for the breakfast rush, years of evenings cleaning up together, years of building something that belongs to both of us. The diner may feel the same to everyone else, but for me, it has become the place where I learned that being seen is worth the risk of being hurt, that love tastes like coffee and smoke and the promise of tomorrow.